Good afternoon, folks. It's great to be here. This is a fantastic meeting of minds. I'm quite sure this is going to be very productive and fertile and lead to many more meetings of critical rationalists and comprehensive critical rationalists, no less. This talk, which I've concocted, is a glimpse into a problem which I fell in love with many years ago and effectively got married to. And it's been highly productive. It's led to so many unfathomable connections to other interesting problems, both in psychology, sociology, and logic and epistemology. That problem that I fell in love with was the evolution, or better, the life and death of ideas in society. Not so much in the mind, but in society. Some of you may already be noticing that I'm alluding to Karl Popper's World 3, but I'll bring that in just a little later. Why is that an interesting problem? Well, if we're interested in the advancement of knowledge, then we want our ideas, the best Enlightenment ideas, to take hold and to flourish by liberty-respecting, Enlightenment-respecting methods. And what is that? The most liberty-respecting method is that of argument, sound critical argument. So it would be very nice if we could be confident that the use of logical argument has the sheer power to transform people's perspectives and ideas, and even society's institutions in the long run. But we are faced with, in the short term, we're faced with the fact that there are a lot of false ideas that pervade our society, and sometimes we may feel pessimistic about the impact of our carefully constructed logical arguments. We've all had this experience. You're arguing with your best friend who marshaled your best collection of statistics. Your argument is watertight, mathematically, logically watertight, and yet you're not having any impact at all. It's like talking to a brick wall. Now, does that automatically mean that sound argument, liberty-respecting argument, is powerless? No, it does not, because we have to take a gestalt shift in the way we look at the way argument has an impact. As Shakespeare said, we work by wit and not by witchcraft, and wit takes dilatory time. So there's this processing time involved in the impact of the best arguments we can muster. So I fashioned, for the purpose of this talk, a thought experiment which would open a little window and help us to dissect and extract from a society with its ideas the main vectors, if you like, the main dimensions along which ideas change, not only in people's minds, but in their abstract, independent form in books and pamphlets. And this is what I call the paradox of Bertrand Russell Ireland. it is meant to separate out the question of the impact of argument from the usual response is, well, the false ideas persist, and we're not able to make any impact with our carefully crafted arguments because of human psychological biases and irrationality and the appeal to tribalism. One must attach oneself to the ideas of tribe, come what may, even to the point of death. But I will try to convince you that we can strip all of this away in this thought experiment.
The premises are sound, yet the conclusion fails.
This is Bertrand Russell Island, so it's populated by clearly highly intelligent, supremely rational agents. No one's going to argue that Bertrand Russell clones aren't the best interlocutor, the best person to have a really good argument with. So they're given the task of classifying all kinds of ideas and memes that are floating in, constantly streaming into this Bertrand Russell Island. And we can imagine that we can actually give them not only extraordinary intellect, but we can stipulate that in terms of separating truth from falsity, given enough time, they're infallible. They always separate out the truth from the false and correctly categorize those ideas. Now, you would expect that under some such circumstances of supreme rationality and even infallibility in some respects, that there would be a convergence of memes or ideas on what everybody on Bertrand Russell Island would consider the truth. But what the fatal error of this conclusion is to assume that Shakespeare was wrong about the crucial role of dilatory time in processing the memes or ideas, or what I would like to call World 3 objects. They are the products, the abstract products of the human mind that form our culture. Because it takes time, and there are constantly new streams of ideas entering the island that need to be categorized, and the population itself of Bertrand Russell's is replenished by some kind of cloning machine in this strange kind of thought world. So we're still left with, at any given time, there will be false ideas that floating around. And in fact, given the suitably defined parameters for this island, you could actually have some false ideas that live forever. So they're always struck by this, what might be to some a pessimistic kind of cloud of error. But there is cause for optimism, and I will try to get us to that point. So we've got this temporal persistence. While evaluating, ideas remain in circulation. They may spread further, remain causally active. If we look at ideas in their sociological context, in terms of the rate at which given ideas are adopted and rejected, we can get a more optimistic view on what appears at any given time. See, at any given time in society, there's large movements of people who seem to be gripped and addicted to what we regard as complete craziness, flat earthers, etc. But the actual research on the adoption and rejection rates bears this point out, that if we've got two dimensions, rate of turnover, which is determined by adoption and rejection, and then size of movement. So you could have a very large movement, but at any given time, so it's large at any given time, but because the rate of turnover is very high, no one person is actually gripped by this, whatever it might be, a flat earthism, for example, that might be an example. No one person that has adopted that idea is addicted to it for very long. Various researchers have found, for example, I've got here the Bird and Reimer study, survey of 1,607 adults in Montreal, found that 75% no longer involved 5 years later in certain religious, at that time they were called new religious movements. Eileen Barker, she's a very well-known researcher on the life of ideas and new religious movements based at the London School of Economics. She found that 61% of those who joined during a 4-month period in 1978 had left within 2.5 years. That's the Unification Church. And, the Scientology has a similar pattern, a similar dynamic turnover characteristics. The purpose of this dynamic model of turnover rates and ideas and movements is to help us separate out the ideas from the people. We want to be able to separate ideas as objective, independent systems from human beings, individuals, and their psychology. So it gets a little deeper now, because we're looking more at as I said, Popper's World 3, which is I would highly recommend people to read up in his book, in particular, Objective Knowledge, following on from the work of Gottlieb Frege and Brentano. Frege is a well-known mathematician and logician who distinguished between the thought that we have subjectively, for example, the moon is made of rock, and the proposition itself, the moon is made of rock, which is not a psychological state, but it's something that can be treated by logic as independent, and it can be written down. It could still exist even if the person dies, even if everyone dies. Our libraries containing propositions would still exist. This is where Popper's idea of a theory's information, he called it information content. It's a little different from the logical content, even though it's another type of logical content, a very interesting kind, because it consists of the class of statements incompatible with the given statement. You can see right away that we're moving away from psychology. This is a logical relationship that cannot be reduced to psychology or neurological state. But this has tremendous ramifications in our understanding of the advancement of knowledge and the Enlightenment. It means, bizarrely, when you first encountered it, it just seemed a bit bizarre, that Einstein's theory was part of the information content of Newton's theory. And I think I've gone a little bit overboard with the elaborateness of this particular slide, because I was contrasting all the aspects of Newton's worldview can I move around easily? Yeah. So its gravity was the core perspective agent, whereas with Einstein, it's geometry. With Newton, instantaneous action at a distance. For Einstein, gravity propagates at speed c. So, and all of these, at these points, there is a logical relationship. But those logical relationships held at the point where Newton was writing Principia, which is, that's why, and you know, the astonishment, you can, well, can you imagine if we had a time machine, how wonderful it would be to bring Newton to the present day, and you kind of would have a face like that of astonishment, wouldn't so there was no way Newton, even though arguably Newton was probably the greatest scientist who ever lived. I mean, I know there's arguments on both sides, but he would have been utterly astonished. So we're in the world of abstract, independent products of the human mind. We're no longer at the level of psychology. So human biases are maybe becoming less significant. That's what I'm trying to push. And in my book, The Myth of the Closed Mind, I do try to elaborate that. I've chosen the phenomenon, or it's a sociological phenomenon, I suppose, papal infallibility, to illustrate how logic, in this sense of information content, and the unfathomable ramifications of any theory, introduce this uncontrollable depth to what we've created. Of course, Einstein's and Newton's theories were perhaps once a daydream, part of their psychology. But once we create these ideas, they're not just atoms, they're systems. And they go far beyond, in just incredible ways, what our psychology can actually capture. There's no way our brain can fully capture or encode all of the information content of a theory. Which is, it's just amazing that we can live in a world where it's kind of like it is an emergent level that's made possible by the fact that we have language, that we can put our theories or ideas into language, and then somehow we get this explosion of possibilities that unleashes. Now, papal infallibility is a great illustration of the idea that if you try to play around, sorry, I should backstep. One of the things that I've been arguing against is the idea that that there's a perfect propaganda machine, that you can design a system of ideas that is so nuanced and constructed that using special ploys and immunizing stratagems that can be reproduced from mind to mind and from generation to generation, irrespective of the impact of criticism. But it's quite clear that these ramifications go beyond the ability of any one individual or even collection of individuals, no matter how bright they are, how powerful they are, controlling. So there is no such thing as a perfect propaganda machine, including, say, the churches, which are often posited. They've often been posited as embodiments of deep irrationalism, and this idea that somehow they can put their thoughts down in a form that's immunized and insulated, impervious to critical discussion. But there is no way that is possible for logical reasons. So summing up, we've got this amazingly rich world, not only on the physical level, but in terms of the theories, and the knowledge that we have created. Knowledge, as David Deutsch emphasizes, knowledge is a part of the world, and that we need to be able to grasp the nature of knowledge, and what part of the nature of knowledge is these logical ramifications or consequences of ideas, the systems of ideas. So it's Bertrand Russell Ireland shows that we may always have false ideas floating around, circulating through culture, but it's not really a cause for ultimate pessimism, because we can have, at the same time, we can have a growth of our island of knowledge, even though there's always, even 1,000 years from now, that maybe there'll be different kinds of errors, but there may be some similar errors, exactly this, or even the exact same errors in pockets. So to conclude the talk, so this is my kind of it's an optimistic view. So as our island of knowledge grows, in an expanding ocean of ignorance, as Newton said, we know a beach. What we don't know is the ocean. But we don't even know how many oceans there are. So it's, despite the fact that error can persist, and some errors will persist perhaps forever, at the same time, that's compatible with the continual and never-ending growth of our knowledge. So that's my thinking.
No?
Any questions?
Eric, I think, is it?
Yeah, thanks a lot for your very inspiring, very nice talk. So just a question I would have is, especially the first part, it reminded me a lot of the essay Myth of the Framework in Popper's book, Myth of the Framework. And part of that essay is, I think, that he deals with the misconception that if two people disagree, they cannot have a productive conversation. And he illustrates that, but I won't go into that right now. And I think one of the things he emphasizes there is that he says, a common misconception is that if two people have a discussion, even if it's a rational discussion, somewhere in that discussion, one of them will just fall over and say, you're right, and then change his mind. Whereas actually, they do learn from each other. So your Bertrand Russell clones, they do learn from each other, but not necessarily always at the moment they speak to each other, or they won't always change their mind. But that's a gradual process. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, or with potential interaction with that essay.
Absolutely, you're on the same page, and I would bolster that by saying that because Thomas Kuhn had this idea that if Einstein and Newton met, they wouldn't understand each other. I tend to think it would just take time, because what they would be faced with was just learning each other's language. So if we, two very intelligent people meet and they're different language, one's English and one's Italian, and they've never studied each other's language, and there's no other reference point. They could eventually, but it would take some time for them to understand one another. So, and learning, Einstein's theories and Newton's, it is effectively like learning an enormous language with actually new conceptual resources.
Yeah, thank you also. I want to
make a remark. You could read your talk in a way that we accumulate truths. Yeah, so we have an incoming stream of truths and wrongs, and we sort. The wrongs are coming in, and unfortunately, some of these wrongs will survive very long, and so on. But optimistically, we accumulate all these truths, and that's fine. And so we have this treasure of truth. I would argue against this because if you see Newton was not enriched by Einstein by adding a formula. He completely overthrew the whole thinking model of Newton. Yeah? So it was not only an addition, so we are more complete in a still incomplete picture, but he completely turned around. And this is what frequently happens with new theories, that they completely turn around what we have been thinking. And this applies for quantum mechanics in the same way. So we can also expect that the successor theory of quantum mechanics will be the same way. It will completely overturn everything what we currently believe is right.
Mm. Yes, I think there's a whole world of unknown unknowns. And I've even toyed with the idea of unknowably unknowables. So I think, yes, I'm on the same page. One of the things that does arise, and I think maybe you're also alluding to that, is that when Einstein produced his theory, that you're not only getting a new theory, but you're getting a reconfiguration of an enormous conceptual, it's a new, radically new conceptual scheme. Although, now, Kuhn would agree with that, but he tended to get the theory and the conceptual scheme the wrong way around. I agree with Popper that first you have a theoretical change, but as that is growing, that forces a growth in the conceptual scheme. So it's not the conceptual scheme changes first and then theory. Theory dominates conception. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. You mentioned in passing that you've been toying with the idea of unknowable unknowns. Could you expand on that and how it relates to? Yeah,
because I'm just at the edge. The unknowable unknowables. Yeah, unknowably unknowables, which kind of stretches it beyond the unknown unknowns. Although, yeah, I could say, I mean, that's what I think Gödel and Alonzo Church they were both looking at that realm. So we don't know, that this is the exciting thing. There could be further barriers that we haven't broken through yet, opening up new worlds to us, new intellectual worlds. Which, so it's very, very stimulating. That's another great reason for pursuing the Enlightenment project. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.